Right, I'm back again. Just reviewing my last recording. I thought, well, actually, I haven't explained to any of you what I did when I found it wouldn't register any of the old-fashioned hard drives or the solid-state drive in the BIOS. So after I'd taken the motherboard apart, what a few connections there were, I stripped it back even further. I left out the monitors going for the RPM to the two water pumps, which you can see in the background shot. Yeah, nothing particularly sophisticated there, just one of the older EK water blocks units with a D5 pump beneath it. And to the side, just move around here. An older reservoir. Looks a bit grubby inside. Funnily enough, that's not algae. That's actually copper particles which build up in there. Now, I've had this with a few different radiators over the years. By far the worst seem to be the coolants radiators. Even though they were flushed, not high pressure, as some people recommend, they always seem to give out small copper particles, and they seem to linger on for years. So, I mean, this particular setup must have been drained 30 times, easily 30 times. I always tend to use green coolant, and even though some of those pipes are quite grubby inside, all those pipes were replaced just a fortnight ago, and that was one of the key issues I had. Again, I don't want to go into too much depth on that kind of rambling long video, but yeah, I've had to be a lot more choosy about the coolant tubes I'm using. I did used to like the UV reactive ones, but they always seem to have even more problems with the plasticizer. And after about 18 months, you'd end up this kind of white goo building up in the reservoirs. And sure enough, as many people have suggested in many different reviews, it definitely turned out to be the tubing. So I'm using Mayhem's Ultra Clear, which I've had no issues with. It's fairly flexible, not as good as some of the laboratory grade tubing, but certainly clear. And I've also been using the LRT Advanced tubing, which is a lot stiffer, a lot harder to bend, slightly different kind of bluish sheen to it. Some people like it, some people don't. I don't really have an issue. They're both very similar, other than the fact that the Mayhem's is more flexible and easier to work with. So I will do a separate video on that, because, as I say, water cooling is probably one of my biggest areas of expertise. Again, not overly interesting. Look at this test rig, especially when everything's unplugged. But going back to the hard drives. So fortunately, having been building computers for a lot of years, I had some spare hard drives. So I had a couple of 2 terabyte Seagate Barracudas and some 1.5 Barracudas. I installed those into this IC.COT hot swap unit, and not wanting to risk another expensive solid state drive, I had a small cheap, I think it was 128 gig Kingston unit. Put those in, and sure enough, and this was about the 4th boot attempt, it actually found them. Found all of them. So installed Windows 10, went through all of that. Don't think I really need to go into any detail on that aspect of things. But I thought I'd go for a clean format on all of the hard drives. So there was nothing left that could potentially cause me any problems. And then I loaded them up with data from a very large 14 terabyte backup drive. And it was during that process that I was coming back with disk errors every now and then. Now, it's pretty rare to get a disk error on Windows telling you you've got an issue. It's kind of something you see, or certainly in my experience, maybe once or twice a year. And that's normally because you've got a bit hacked off and you end up switching your computer off because it's hung rather than hitting the reset button. Sometimes that can cause a little bit of file corruption. But this was a lot more significant than that. So after many hours of loading the drives up to a decent level of capacity with music, videos, and 2 or 3 backups of data, yep, I was starting to get errors randomly across the drives. So, yep, there is a problem here, and not a particularly obvious problem with the motherboard, and that's the key reason it's going back. I could have probably lived with the OLED not doing what it's supposed to be doing, although I've got to say, when you spend this amount of money on a motherboard, you do expect everything to be working properly. A couple of other things I noticed when I was using the endoscope camera. The thermal material around this VRM heatsink was pretty ragged looking around the edges. It wasn't clear whether it just hadn't been cut straight, or whether it had been put on and the edges had got damaged and they just squashed it on regardless. But it didn't look as good as I'd normally expect from an Asus motherboard. I've had a couple of EVGA graphics cards where the thermal interface material hasn't been particularly well fitted, and oddly enough that was on one of their most expensive ones. If you can remember the very first generation of Titans, the Titan Blacks, I actually had 3 of those. In fact, I still got them. They were a horrendous price. In fact, probably the first kind of consumer grade graphics card, which was a stupid price, £865 from memory. Except there were more expensive ones for graphics professionals available back then, but that was a lot of money. And obviously when you've got triple SLI, the return, well, diminishing return is an understatement because of the actual load it puts onto the other 2 graphics cards. But yeah, it was kind of shocking when I took them apart, because one of them in particular was running much, much hotter. And I'm not talking about the Verse graphics card, it was actually the second one. So a lot less load, shouldn't have had a problem. But not only was it not fitted particularly well, but it seemed to be decomposing. In other words, the thermal interface material was actually producing like an oily residue, which was starting to migrate out of the small gaps. I will show you the cards in a later video and some pictures where I've refurbished them. So effectively I stripped them down completely. And when I say stripped them down, they were hydrocoppers, water-cooled ones, from the manufacturer, not an aftermarket water cooling kit, water block rather. So yeah, disappointing when you spend that kind of money. I've also got a bank of hydrocopper GTX 780 classified, which, yeah, they're an old card now, but again, it seems wasteful to throw them away. I've got a bank of 3 of those. They're probably going in an older generation motherboard, maybe a Rampage, IV Extreme, that kind of age group, a 6-core, something, moderately quick. And that'll be an ideal hand-me-down computer for one of the relatives. I know some of them are a bit hesitant about having water-cooled systems. And they worry about, yes, how often do I have to drain it? Do I have to top it up? But again, I will go into that in later videos. Thank you for listening.